Last week we read from the Gospel of St. Luke, where he talks about wanting to tell the story of Jesus. And before we get into the story of Jesus, we look back at the very beginning of the story where the understanding of Yahweh comes into the consciousness of people and then ultimately culminates in the person and the ministry of Jesus. And I look back at that, and you hear these stories of, Adam and Eve, and then there's Noah's Ark, and then we have Abraham and his sons Isaac and Jacob, and then the 12 sons of Jacob, and then they're in Egypt and they wind up being enslaved, and then Moses comes along and frees the people from the slavery of Egypt, and they go through the promised land. Moses feeds the Israelites with manna and quail. And then they finally get to the promised land where they're given the Ten Commandments. And when they follow the Ten Commandments, the story is, well, their lives work. When they follow Yahweh, their lives work. And yet inevitably they wind up going off the reservation. And when they do that, their lives begin to disintegrate and they become weakened. And so their story in the Old Testament is always this sense of God creating this covenant with his people, Israel. He is committed to them. They are committed to him for a while, and then inevitably they wind up, going off on their own way. And every time they do that, they start to experience pain and suffering, and their lives don't work. And then God calls them back, and then they return to this covenant love. And this goes on through the years, through 1000 BC, where we get into Saul and David and Solomon. These are the mighty, glorious years of the kingdom of Israel. And then we get into the prophets, where they're constantly calling the king to make sure that the king is always answerable to Yahweh, to not be too powerful. And then we move into times with the prophets where we move into 600 BC and 500 BC, where they're captured by the Babylonians and they have stories of being in exile and being away from their homeland. And then finally, again, restored back to their homeland. And then we move up into the time where now the Jewish people are now occupied by the Roman Empire, and once again, they are an oppressed people. During the course of this history, you have their sense where the Jewish nation becomes aware of this divine presence, Yahweh. Interestingly enough, Yahweh meaning I am, the form of the verb to be. I am being itself. I am the essence of being and the presence that is in their lives. They were the ones that evolved out of that sacrificial system that had originated where primitive human beings, would experience an earthquake or some sort of a drought, and they would have attributed that to they were being punished by the God that lived above the sky, and they started to sacrifice grain and animals, and even sadly enough would sacrifice their firstborn child. And so it's out of that whole system that we move into the beginning of Jesus, where he is a Jewish man and he is a man of the temple, and he's listening to the scripture, and he hears the same scripture that everybody else is hearing, but he's hearing burnt offerings and sacrifices I take no delight, but a pure and contrite heart is what Yahweh asks of you. For some reason, everybody else had this mindset of getting into sacrificing, the lambs and goats and grain. It's almost silly to think that like the God of the universe is interested in your corn or is interested in this lamb to be offered. I mean, and then they even get into the detail of it, that it had to be 1 year old, it had to be male, and it had to be unblemished. So it had to be this perfect lamb, as if, yeah, that's really going to satisfy the God of all that is. So out of this, Jesus sees this, and he starts his ministry, where he starts to talk to the people about transforming Judaism. Jesus didn't want to start Christianity. Jesus wanted to get the Jewish people to understand the heart of what Yahweh was seeking, and it was not into the sacrificial ritual of offering things as if God would be interested in that. So we have now today's scripture passage from St. Paul, the classic reading from Corinthians, which I'm sure all of you have heard at some point or another. It's typically used every time there's a wedding. And I wanted to address this and to have each one of us take a look at that, where Paul says that love is patient, love is kind, it's not jealous, it's not pompous, it's not inflated or rude, doesn't seek its own way, it's not quick-tempered, it doesn't brood, it doesn't pout, it doesn't celebrate over the wrongdoings of others. And you think about that, and every one of us would agree, yeah, that's what it really means to love. Every one of us, when we read that, knows deep down in our hearts that that is really the essence of what it means to love. But then we also have this question: how do I love compared to what we just read in Corinthians? This really is the heart of the message of Jesus Christ. Somehow it starts with all these stories in the Old Testament and the Ten Commandments and becoming a people, and they get into all their rituals and their ceremonies of how to wash pots and pans and what kind of food they can eat, what's kosher, what's not kosher. And ultimately, it's culminating in this message that we hear today. So it's almost like God is trying to communicate throughout history, first, his divine presence, his essence, and then move people along the way. And as we go through, we see those little sprinklings of those messages from the prophets, that what God is interested in is in your heart, and not in ritual, and not in ceremonies, and not in miters and croziers and incense, but one simple thing: where is your heart? So today, read that passage again from Corinthians chapter 13, verse 4 to 13, and ask yourself, how do you love compared to the words that we read today from St. Paul? How long?
9 minutes.
I was all, yeah. Yeah, I could do it again.